David's going to speak for us in a moment, but he's actually asked me to read a short passage, and it's from the second volume, the biography of the life and times of Jesus and his followers, second volume written by Luke. It's called Acts, and you can find it printed there, or it's also on the chat, if you have a look there. It's called Acts from chapter 17, and I'm going to read this, and then I'll invite David to come and speak to us. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob and started a riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house." They are all defying Caesar's decree, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they put Jason and the others on bail and let them go. Over to you, David.
I've got a clicker. That's good. Okay. So this goes a whole lot easier if we can discuss. So I'll let you eat, and while you're eating, and those of you who are watching online as well, you eat your food, and then, in fact, you can eat your food and put in questions at the same time, so it doesn't so much apply to you. But so I'll introduce this, and then if there's no discussion, we'll go back to work earlier. And if there is, you can go back to work later. So, says he.
There we go.
Well, the clicker is not clicking, so
we'll fix that.
you can. I'll let you sort that. So take us. You can put us on to our next slide. But let me suggest to you this: the normal image of Christianity, if it's there at all, it can either be quite negative, or, to be honest, most people just think, it's quite nice, if you like that sort of thing. They don't. It's kind of nice and cozy and warm and largely irrelevant. Belonging to the church is seen as relevant as belonging to a knitting club or a Star Trek society or something like that. If it floats your boat, that's fine. But religion is revolutionary, we don't like. That's what we're going to look at. And this is my one of my favorite maps. I love maps. And this is one of my favorite ones, not least because now I live in Australia, and Australia is obviously the center of the world. And where I come from here, Scotland, it's right at the far fringe. Now, when I lived in Scotland, it was the center of the world. It's funny how we do that wherever we live, it's the center of the world. If we lived in China, then of course you have basically the Middle Kingdom and all the others. You have the Central Kingdom and so on. But when we talk of the world turned upside down, I'm not really thinking of that. I'm thinking of revolution. And what I'm going to do in the 4 days that we're here, so it's 4 weeks we're going to do this. We're going to look at Acts chapter 17. We're going to look at revolution. Then next week we're going to look at reason. And then the following week we're going to look at religion. And the final week we're going to look at resurrection. But when we speak of revolution, let's go on and have a look at this is the kind of image that I think people have of, where's the next one? Oh, the clicker. Oh, I've got the clicker now. Oh, sorry. Here we go. So it's quite funny because how politics has worked nowadays. I was quite active at university, and I was quite left-wing. You could work that out because my nickname was Red Robbo. But it's funny now, I get called a fascist or far right. And it seems to me that politics is incredibly mixed up. But this idea of revolution, the one that really struck me in these posters was, I want to be heard. And it seems to me that that's a very, very, very 21st century Western obsession. that, you got to hear me, you got to hear me. We're all shouting. How is someone going to hear me? Whereas I want us to listen and to think and to learn from history, to learn from the Bible, to learn from interaction with one another. When I think of revolution as well, as a historian, I'm thinking of the French Revolution. I studied that a little bit. The Bolsheviks, study that a bit more. The Spartacist Revolution after the First World War in Germany, which ultimately led to the rise of Hitler, Weimar Germany, and Nazi Germany. I think of the English Civil War and the Puritan Revolution that occurred there. I think of Mao Zedong and his revolution. I also think of how we could talk about the sexual revolution of the 1960s, the industrial revolution, the technological revolution as well. So a revolution is something that really changes things. And it's funny, in our society, people keep demanding change, but it just doesn't seem to work. So I thought, where would we listen? Well, this is the second best-selling book in the world in the 20th century. And of course, the thoughts, the Little Red Book, the thoughts of Chairman Mao Zedong. I've put a wee quote from each one. This one: "It is the responsibility of all to cultivate themselves and study Marxism-Leninism deeply. It is also necessary for people to turn their attention to contemporary problems along empirical lines." I think the book is dated, but the Maoist philosophy, which most Western people rather arrogantly thought was going to go the way of Russian communism, is probably going to end up one of the maybe 3 predominant philosophies in the world, certainly, or political systems. I think we're entering the century of China, and whether it will be Communist Party China, as I suspect, or something different, who knows. Mein Kampf. I've only read parts of Mao's Little Red Book. I really do need to read the rest of it, but I have read Mein Kampf, and it's a somewhat depressing book in lots of ways. But even in all rubbish books, you can get some good things, and I was quite intrigued with this one: "What luck for rules that men do not think." And I think that actually is one that applies to our culture, because if we don't think, I'm a pastor, and people say, "What's your job?" And I say, "My job is to get people to think." And they go, no, religion doesn't do that. Religion brainwash. I said, no. My job is to get people to think. Because one of the things that depresses me is going to universities and seeing how students all think the same way, which means they're not thinking. If everyone thinks exactly the same thing. I remember there was a survey done in Dublin showing that 98% of students thought the European Union was a good thing. Well, I'm sorry, even Xi Jinping or the North Korean dictator Kim Jong, they don't get 98% vote. That's bizarre that happens. And I'm quite surprised that our universities, particularly, this is bizarre, particularly the top ones, have become monoversities where there's only one way of thinking. The Communist Manifesto. "From each according to his means to each according to his needs" is, of course, one of the key phrases in it. That's a key phrase that Karl Marx, the Jew, took from the New Testament, actually from 2 Corinthians chapters 7 and 8. One of the most influential books ever in history, and it still amazes me, absolutely amazes me, that I was reading Solzhenitsyn's Gulag, and Solzhenitsyn says of Hitler, he was an amateur compared with Stalin. And it amazes me that people won't go on television and say, "I am a Nazi," unless they're just crazy. But they will go on television and say, "I'm a communist." And communism seems respectable. I think it's not wrong to say that at least 100 million lives were lost to communism in the 20th century, and yet people say, well, we want to go there. But very influential. Jordan B. Peterson, 12 Rules for Life. Why is that there? I don't think it's as influential as the other books, although I think it is today. Whether it will last in history, I doubt. But you realize that Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist, famous for one or two things, but remarkable man, that he can do a 90-minute lecture on Genesis. He's not a Christian. He'll do a 90-minute lecture on Genesis, and 12 million people will watch it. In the church, we think, let's do a 2-minute soundbite, and we're struggling to get, our mum, cat, and dog to watch it, really. I mean, I realize that people who are watching on here will be in their billions by the time we're finished. But, it's funny, those of us who do these kind of talks, we often think that. We say, oh, this is going to go for, 100 years. No, it's not. You'll be really lucky if in a week's time anyone remembers anything about it or ever looks at it. But Peterson, how does he get 10 million people to watch a really heavy lecture? And he does. And here's the amazing thing. He can come to Sydney, and the town hall, there are people, young men, queuing all the way along the street to get in. So he sells it out to give them a talk on stuff that's pretty heavy and pretty deep. So that's an influential thing. Now, we're going to look at another book that's really influential, the Bible. I like the fact that this one is obviously well used. I'm always suspicious when I go into a home and see an absolutely pristine Bible. Usually indicates it's not that well used. But the Bible, can we call that a revolutionary book? Well, the passage that we read, let me just explain why it is. Now, verse 6, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. The world turned upside down is I was told after this morning, it is a song in the musical Hamilton, which I haven't seen, but I have tickets to go and see. Unfortunately, I now have to give those tickets up. So if anyone wants tickets for Hamilton, you're very welcome. But it's also the title of a book by the Marxist historian Christopher Hill about the English Civil War, The World Turned Upside Down. Utterly brilliant book, if somewhat a little depressing. But it's taken from this because it is arguing that Christianity turned the world upside down. Now, what happened here was Paul went to Thessalonica, major city, went down the motorway, if you like, to Berea. Interesting that the gospel went, first of all, to the cities. He would go to the center of the cities. He'd go to situations, possibly even like this boardroom, where people would come in and hear. In Ephesus, he hired a university lecture theater called the Lecture Hall of Tyrannus. I'm pretty sure Tyrannus was not the man's name, and it was then teachers had nicknames. And it said he lectured there for 2 years, every day, during the middle of the day, when it was extremely hot. And it said that the whole of Asia, which now we would now call the whole of Turkey, heard the word of the Lord. So Paul went and he did this. Now, we're going to look next week at how it says that he reasoned with them and he made it reasonable. But I'm thinking of this response that people became jealous. In fact, the religious authorities, the Jewish authorities in that city became jealous of him. He was attracting much more attention. And so he, in effect, got cancelled. Cancel culture is not new. And I'm just wondering lots and lots of different things. I have so many questions that I hope that we can discuss. I'm wondering when the church last had that kind of impact in this city. I'm wondering why? Why was this? And when I look at the history, one of the things that strikes me very much is the world was turned upside down, not because Paul was advocating revolution on the streets, but because the change that was required in people's attitudes revolutionized things. So take, for example, relationships of male and female. In the Greco-Roman pagan society, as well as in the Jewish society, women were unquestionably second-class citizens. Christianity changed that, bit by bit. Not massively in terms of some kind of revolutionary thing, but just bit by bit. And it's interesting in all of Paul's letters, and Paul's supposed to be a misogynist, how he references women. I find that fascinating. Slaves. Now, we're often told that the Bible supported slavery. I don't agree with that. I think what happens in the Bible is the regulation of slavery in a context of a society. Every society in the world, slavery is not new, by the way. Every society in the world has had slavery. And to be honest, slavery is making a comeback in the modern world. But Christianity dealt with slavery. How? By changing the fundamental understanding of how we thought of human beings. Human beings could not be property because all human beings are made in the image of God. Ultimately, they belong only to God. And that is something that was foundational. Now, Larry Siddentop in his book, The Making of the Western Individual, argues it took about 400 years for that to permeate through, but it did permeate through. That's the point. You know, it's very easy to be, I find it intriguing how people are for causes that doesn't cost them anything. So, you know, we would all say, oh, we'd have been anti-slavery back in the beginning of the 19th century. Really? If it involved you giving up your business, if it involved you losing a great deal? Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. You would need another motivation. I think it was revolutionary in terms of how it saw the family. I think it was revolutionary in terms of sex, and again, in particularly in the exploitation of women and children. I think it was revolutionary in terms of economics and revolutionary in terms of health, but we can return to all those. So here's a paradox. Sometimes you use the phrase, Christians will talk about conservative Christians. I don't like that phrase for lots of reasons. Number one, it's like so much of today's language. What do we mean by it? So conservative can mean we wish to conserve what is good. Or it can mean conservative politically, a certain political viewpoint. But what it really means, if you want to, is Christians who hold on to and who believe the Bible and who don't take, inverted commas, a progressive view. In other words, we go along with the Bible. Now, if we go along with the Bible, it means we end up being the real radicals, because that's what Paul did here. He taught the Bible, he taught about Jesus, and it turned the world upside down. Paul was being charged with high treason, and there was enough truth in that charge to make it a very dangerous one. Disturbing the peace was not allowed. The Emperor Claudius had banned all predictions suggesting a change of ruler. Now go and read 2 Thessalonians. Thessalonica is the city he was in. In his letter to the Thessalonians, his second letter, he talks a lot about the coming of King Jesus. He broke the law. He was not allowed to do that. That was illegal, or at least you could argue that. And so he was called, there's a word that's used, he was basically called a terrorist or a far-right extremist. He was called a false shepherd. He was called a hate monger. Had they understood what he was saying? Do they understand what we're saying? Could we ever be charged with disturbing the peace? There's a sense in which I hope so. I want to disturb the peace. I want to disturb the peace of the graveyard. But I want to come to an end just by thinking of it this way. The revolution that Paul speaks of, or that Luke records, this turning upside down, unlike any other revolution, it genuinely is a revolution of love. I used to have this lovely little book called A Revolution of Love and Balance, and I think that's what it is. We don't kill for our faith. We're prepared to die for our faith, but we don't kill for it. We don't plant bombs. We don't kill, torture, and abuse for Jesus. We're good citizens and neighbors. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, by the way, is a very interesting verse because it says that Paul worked day and night, hard, with his hands. Why? That's like, I don't know, professor at the University of Sydney or the Vice Chancellor of the University of Sydney not being paid a lot of money and saying, well, I've got to supplement my income by working at McDonald's. It just doesn't make sense. And it didn't make sense for them to have a religious teacher like Paul who provided for himself in that way. It was quite revolutionary. But the main revolution for us is simply this. We're not teaching a philosophy. We're not teaching a political theory. We're not even teaching a code of ethics, what people call Christian values. A lot of people like Jordan Peterson, like Doug Murray and others who are not Christians will talk about we need Christian values, but you can't have values without the root, and the root is Jesus Christ. And the radical nature of Christianity, which makes it applicable across every culture, is it points us to one person, Jesus Christ, and not just his radical teaching, but what he did on the cross and what he continues to do. So I will leave it there. What I'm suggesting is that as the church has compromised with the culture or just gone weird, we've lost our salt and light stuff. And I think that from a Christian point of view, we need to get that back. And I think for those of you who are not Christians, you need to find out something about this. I don't know if you need to read the Communist Manifesto, but you absolutely certainly do need to read the Bible. Far more influential and far more important. Right, Peter, we'll leave it there.
All right, thank you very much, David. We'll give David just a chance to grab a drink and catch his breath. But this is where it's over to you, so you get a chance to ask questions. So we've got some questions that have come through on the text, so you can text them to the number that you can see on the sheets or that will appear at the base of the Zoom screen. At the same time, you may wish to scan the QR code, which is at the back of this form, and there's some options there in terms of taking things a little bit further, or there's a URL on the base of the Zoom screen. So, all right, we'll start with this one, David. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Start with whatever you want. I can't say I'll answer. But.
Okay, this is a question that's come through in the chat. I often think, says the questioner, that our sports like rugby, American football, and cage fighting are much more like the gladiators of the Roman Empire. What other comparisons would you make? What do you think are the implications for Christians?
Okay, so my theory is this, and I've been thinking about this and teaching this for about 30 years now, that rather than progressing to a secular nirvana, we are regressing to a Greco-Roman pagan view of the world. And that was greatly reinforced. And my mind is terrible. I'm just trying to remember the name of the author, but it was essentially a book talking about how we were going back to a Greco-Roman pagan way of living. Certain things, gap between rich and poor, ideas about sex, the whole worship of the body, everyone, going to gyms and, I've said this before and people have said, oh, are you against gyms? Well, no, I probably need to join one. But it's just this strange idolization of the body. I mean, I don't often go to Bondi Beach. When I do go, or at any of the other beaches around here, I do actually like swimming in the sea, but then there are kind of all these super, muscular Aussie men. None of you here, by the way, sorry. they're like that. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is, I need to go to the gym or get some steroids or something. But it's that, you can see it's that body worship that's there as well. And I do think that's an interesting point about the cage fighting and so on. I think we have our blood sports as well. I think Australian politics is a bit of a blood sport, to be honest. But I think there are other things that we have our mobs as well. We have Twitter mobs and social media mobs. And I think we're moving towards that view of politics, elites, the World Economic Forum, and we're now moving towards a stage where people are beginning to say, should we really let the common people have a vote? What do they know? And I just think we're heading that direction. We're not there yet, but we're heading that direction.
Okay, thanks, David. You mentioned verse 6 in your talk, and it talked about another king being Jesus. Do you want to talk about the significance of that a little bit more in terms of Rome and what was the system of the day? Okay,
the Romans were genius. How could this one city control, an area at times that went from Iran to Britain, North Africa? How could they do it? Their army wasn't big enough. So how did they do it? Eventually they would be overtaken by the barbarians, but they lasted several centuries, which is really long for an empire. And actually the Byzantine Empire lasted over 1,000 years, which is incredibly long by world standards. The only thing that outdoes that is the Chinese. How they did it was brilliant. So they would go to an area, they would conquer an area, and they would say, in today's terms, we're multi-religious, multi-ethnic, you keep your gods, that's fine, no worries. You carry on worshiping your own gods. But we're going to add one extra, Caesar. And the big advantage that Caesar had was he was alive. So he could give commands. And so they actually used religion to control people. Where Paul's message and the Christian message was revolutionary was when it said, no, there's only one God. And that was so revolutionary that in Greece, in Thessalonica, and Berea, in Athens, Corinth, elsewhere, they would have been considered atheists. In fact, they were. The first Christians were actually called atheists by the Greeks because they didn't have temples, they didn't have clergy, they didn't have sacrifices, they rejected the other gods. And it was the most revolutionary thing they could have done. So if I come back to Xi Jinping, what he's done is actually quite remarkable in terms of control. Because he said to the churches, you carry on, you do what you want, but you've got to have the 10 Commandments of Xi Jinping up on the wall. You've got to swear loyalty. He had a deal with the Catholic Church, a kind of secret deal, which he's broken now, whereby now any priest has to swear loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party first and not allow any external interference, which is bye-bye to the Pope. And I just think that the way that this message, I think the Romans were right to recognize that this message would either completely undermine the empire or take it over, and it ended up taking it over.
Okay. We've got another question here. Where would you say Christians naturally fall on the political spectrum, left or right? And the questioner says, perhaps separate economically and socially.
Yeah. This is quite important. Steve McAlpine and I, my colleague, we do this thing called the kitchen table. And we've just done 4 of these on looking at, are you a Christian? Are you a communist? Are you a fascist? Are you a progressive? Or are you a Christian Democrat kind of thing? And I think this is really important for somebody, anyone who's my age and older will find this difficult. Left and right don't mean, words change. Left and right don't mean what they meant when I was at university. So left wing meant economically left wing, social justice, things like that. Today you can be a billionaire and be left wing. And there are people who claim that. I never thought in my life, the last general election in the United Kingdom, the majority of working class people voted Conservative. My understanding, I've looked at some of the figures for the elections here. My understanding here is that it's going the same way with the Queensland miners. It's going the same way out in here in West Sydney. You're far more likely to vote Green or Progressive if you live in Newtown than if you live in West Sydney. And ironically, yet these people will say we're radical and we are supporting the poor and all that kind of stuff. And it's virtue signaling. So left and right, in traditional terms, you've got to really struggle with that. I think now politically what you've got is you've got socially progressive and socially conservative. And socially progressive, in my view, is regressive. I think you can be a Christian and be left-wing. I think you can be a Christian and be right-wing in traditional terms. But I think in modern terms, it's very hard to follow the Bible and to be socially progressive, because I think social progressivism is wanting to take Christianity out of morality, education, and everything. So I was once described in a newspaper article as an extreme Marxist economically and an extreme fascist morally. So I think that's probably just about right. No.
Okay, yeah. We've got a heartfelt question here coming through from the text. Look, the questioner says, look, there's a revolution and a massacre literally going on right now in Myanmar. Yeah. Do Christians have an obligation to stand with the people of Myanmar so that we can find opportunities to introduce Jesus to them when things settle down? So what is our obligation?
Okay, but there's a massacre going on with the Uyghurs. There's a massacre, there's trouble going on in South Sudan. That's always been the case. And if you go back Paul's day, there were wars and rumors of wars, and there will continue to be wars and rumors of wars. Does that mean we don't care? No. Does it mean that we would support simplistic solutions? No. I think what it means is, for me, I wouldn't trust any system, but I would want the opportunity and the freedom to proclaim the gospel. And I know Christians who've been working with the Rohingya refugees, the Muslim ones up in the north. Aung San Suu Kyi was a big heroine for a lot of people, and then she supported the suppression of the Rohingyas. It's never as simple as we might like to portray it. Even if I'm critical, and I am, of Xi Jinping, what happens if he disappears and the Chinese Communist Party collapses? There could be an absolute bloodbath in China as well. So I just don't think there are simple solutions to all of this stuff. But I do think that Western liberal democracies will not survive without the root of them, which is Christianity. And I think what replaces that will be worse than what we lose. So back to the Myanmar situation. I personally, I think if the regime, the new regime comes in and it's oppressing people and so on, maybe sanctions might work. But to be honest, the West goes against Myanmar, the Chinese government, the Communist Party are going to come in and back it. And they're far more powerful than any Western government, even the Americans.
Well, I think we've just got time for one more question. A lot of people seem very angry today. Anger seems to be an acceptable mode of behaviour. Is that a good way to start a revolution, says the questioner?
I'm hesitating a little bit because anger's not always wrong. I mean, the obvious answer is to go, no, love everybody. But anger's not always wrong. It's right to be angry about different things. So as I'm walking here from the station, I do a podcast, and I set this up, and I was trying to get a song, and the Cranberries have this song called Zombies. And you should honestly, I couldn't believe that the Cranberries, like a decade ago, and this song Zombies, I thought, nobody will listen to this nowadays. It's got 1 billion views on YouTube. I've got 1 billion. This is better than Korean pop, it's amazing. And I was just, it's such an angry song. Right. And I love it because it's angry. Because we should be angry at things that are wrong. However, you can't have a revolution based on anger, because what do? The revolution eats itself. You just kill people. You're just violent. You just, there's been a sexual revolution. And one of the most amusing moments of my life, although I shouldn't, this is Schadenfreude, was seeing Germaine Greer, who led, the female unit, good Aussie feminist. And I'm with Germaine at this moment in time because she got no platformed by universities in the UK. And I just thought, well, when Germaine Greer gets no platformed, when Peter Tatchell gets no platformed, which is what's happening, the revolution eats itself. And I think revolutions tend to be bloody. They tend to be very destructive. And that's not what Christianity is about. I think we should be angry, but we should direct ourselves towards the love of Christ, and we should learn to love our enemies, and we should learn to share the love of Christ with everyone. I think that is the most revolutionary force in the whole world. I've just, in the Roman world, the way that Christians died when they were persecuted had such a tremendous impact on people. So yeah, I'm not saying, I do think Christians should stand up for what's right. I think we should stand up for the poor. I think we should argue for freedom, particularly religious freedom, on which I think all other freedoms are based. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to turn the world upside down is the love of Christ. So,
okay. Well, thank you very much, David. And next week, David's going to be joining us again and speaking about reason.